Kendi, how are you?
I am well. How are you
Have you
doing?
moved to Boston yet? Have you moved to Boston?
I have moved to Boston. Yeah,
Okay, all right. Good luck with that.
thank you.
Okay,
It's not
Mr.
winter yet.
Jones. Mr. Jones, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing okay. Bright day here in Columbus, Ohio.
It's okay. That's good to hear. Well, thank you both so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm excited to speak with both of you. And whenever I talk to two people together, I often look for points of connection. And I was looking at the two of you, I'm realizing that both of you are in your 30s. Both of your mothers are named Carol. And both of you talk a lot in your books, even though your books on the surface are very different, about the role of personal transformation and sort of personal understandings that you achieved about yourselves. And so I wanted to start by asking you whether you feel that understanding yourself is the first step to conquering all the isms in our society. Does it really start with you? And I'll start with you, Saeed. How about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's certainly, it's not static. It is ever evolving. But yeah, I mean, at least speaking to my own personal experiences, I feel like, my early years as a teenager in the suburbs of North Texas, the years where I was beginning to understand what it felt like, for example, to be one of the only Black kids, in my advanced English classes, or beginning to understand my identity as, being gay, being attracted to men, in contrast, seemingly, to everyone around me. Developing that self awareness was the beginning of developing my understanding of who I am in America. And I think, now, all these decades later, anything I've done effectively has been birthed out of a deeper understanding of who I am. So yeah, I think kind of getting to know and examine our identities and ourselves, is the beginning of understanding how we connect to one another.
What about you, Professor Kendi? Uh, I I remember being really struck by the opening passages of your latest book, How to Be an Antiracist, where you talk about the speech that you gave, one of those classic Martin Luther King Day oration contests. I actually know that contest. My nephew
Mhm.
competed in that very same
Right.
auditorium, um, and may have given a very similar speech for all I remember. All I remember is he really wanted to go to the buffet afterwards, and we had a little argument about whether we'd go to the buffet or someplace else. And since I was treating, I kind of won. But it's a surprisingly painful chapter, wouldn't you agree? When you talk about the fact that you gave this speech and you got so many huzzas for giving this speech, and in subsequent years you call it your nightmare, where you realize that everything you were saying was in fact a kind of a reflection of Black self-hatred. And it's a pretty powerful thing to think about. But I have to ask you, because you are sort of classically trained as a political scientist, as a historian, do you think that the kind of search for a new path forward begins with an understanding of self? Do you think that?
I do, and I think Saeed talked about the role of understanding one's identity, and I completely agree, and I would add to that even understanding one's own ideas. And so as a Black teenager, I was constantly being fed ideas in the 90s when I lived in New York City and ultimately Northern Virginia, that there was something wrong with me, that there was something wrong with young Black teens and young Black people and Black people more broadly. And ultimately, I started believing that. I started believing that there was something wrong with Black people. And because ultimately, either there was something wrong with Black people or there was something wrong with society. Either there was, something
Mhm.
bad about Black people or there was something bad about our policies. And I ended up believing it was something wrong with Black people, with me, and really the rest of my life was seeking to really overcome those ideas to begin to realize that no, there was nothing wrong with Black people and everything wrong with racism. And the more I gained a self-awareness of my own ideas, the more I was able to essentially shed myself of those ideas and adopt ideas that really reflected reality.
I noted that you're both in your 30s, and part of the reason I thought to mention that is as we are speaking in this moment, we are just saying goodbye to one of the great icons of our century, John Lewis, the Georgia congressman, the great sort of civil rights leader, um, being laid to rest in this moment as we are speaking now. And one of the reasons I found it sort of fascinating is that because you're both in your 30s, neither of you, I believe, has this kind of, you know, I would say kind of lived experience of segregation as it was experienced by people of John Lewis's era. But even having said that, I wanted to ask, does this moment feel different to you, even to you at your, forgive me for pointing out your age, but it is a different sort of generation. Does this feel like a pivotal moment in our country's history, in the life of our country together? Sayed, maybe I'll start with you because you're younger by just a couple of years.
Sure. Yeah. It does feel different. I think now, as one thing I will say is, I feel that now as an adult, I realize that a lot of my family members, when I was a kid, who were alive, during the height of what we think of as the civil rights era, and did experience it, as adults, I realized that by the time I was born, I was witnessing their trauma. And they didn't talk about it. I think there was a lot of silence and a lot of
Mhm,
unaddressed
mhm,
pain that I grew up with, that created a situation with me where I was like, "What's going on?" I didn't have a lot of context because I didn't come from a family of storytellers. I think in part because they hadn't even gotten over what had happened. But I would say, yes, this moment does feel different in terms of what I've witnessed in my lifetime, because it feels like this is the first time racism, but specifically white supremacy, has been taken on as a conversation that we all are engaged in. I feel like in the past, even as recently as when we think about um, the direct actions and protests and conversations sparked by the deaths of people like Sandra Bland or Trayvon Martin or Eric Garner, it still felt like Black people specifically were owning, driving, and maintaining the conversation on our own. And now I feel that though we are certainly the heart of the conversation for obvious reasons, I feel like there is a coalition building that I am seeing that feels unique and special, and I hope that there's like some lasting transformation as a result of it. I hope.
I want to come back to that point in a minute. I want to hear from Professor Kendi first, and then, like, how do we feel about the fact that this moment doesn't feel as owned by Black people as previous moments have been? I want to hear a little bit more of how we feel about that. But Professor Kendi, what about you? Does this feel like a different moment to you?
I do, and I think you started off talking about the passing on of John Lewis, and of course also C.T. Vivian, and what's
Mhm,
striking even about their passing during this sort of summer is in many ways it seems as if I almost feel as if it's almost a passing of the guard, a passing of the guard from the civil rights generation who really shook up this country and participated in good trouble, for decades,
mhm,
to, really our generation who is essentially really in many
mhm,
ways through these demonstrations and through the voices, and many of the voices are younger folks who are at the heart of this conversation, are really sort of carrying on that movement and really trying to stand on the shoulders of those giants like John Lewis. And so I'm beginning to really conflate the two. Um, and I know that, many people of my generation, hugely admire um, the civil rights generation, and at the same time feel that it's really our obligation to carry on, um, the movement that they of course sacrificed, and even as Saeed said, was traumatized from.
And I thank you for lifting up the name of C.T. Vivian. I also want to lift up the name of Charles Evers, the brother of
Yes.
Medgar Evers, who so courageously went back and took up the mantle, even as his brother was slain in the driveway of his own home. So
Right.
I do want to lift up those names along with John Lewis's. So thank you for that. I was thinking a lot about that, about death, frankly, because one of the things about your book, Saeed, that I think hits people so deeply is the fact that even as a young man, you still saw a relationship with death that frankly young people aren't supposed to feel. I mean, young people aren't supposed to think about dying. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, that is the condition of so many young Black men in our country, and unfortunately, young Black women as well. And I do
Right.
want to ask if that has changed for you. I mean, you speak about it in the book. I mean, hopefully, I can find the pages where you talked about the fact that growing up as you did, sort of in the era of um, HIV/AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, you talked about the fact that as a young here I'll read it if I can. I won't read it as beautifully as you would, but you said that you were talking about a play that you attended at your high school,
Right.
a reading of which was performed at your high school around Matthew Shepard's death. Matthew Shepard was the young college student who was viciously murdered in Laramie, Wyoming, and you talked about the fact that as I was walking through the dusty fluorescent lit hallway, halfway to the assembly hall, trying with every filament of my body to look cool, when the two truths finally collided. Being Black can get you killed, being gay can get you killed. Being a Black gay boy is a death wish, and one day, if you're lucky, your life and death will become some artist's new project. And you're obviously talking about it's piercing. It's piercing, but it's also something that so many of us have lived with for one reason
Right.
or another. And I do want to ask whether, in part, does the current moment give you a sense that isn't the only path, that a future generation of Black boys won't grow up thinking about death before they should be?
Um, I think there's the possibility of that being different. I mean, something that I'm struck by is, I woke up this morning, and forgive me, I can't recall her name, but I read about a Black trans woman who was murdered. I think just in the last few days,
Mm-hmm,
and many Black trans people were killed. During Pride Month. This year
mm-hmm,
actually, and the statistics seem to get worse every year. And I draw attention to that to say that unfortunately, so many of us, when we are developing an understanding of our identity, as I was saying, that kind of crucible where we go, wait a minute, I'm not like all the white kids in my class. I'm not like all the straight kids in my class. What's different, and what does this matter? One of the ways that that transformation is signaled is we are made aware of the peril. We see faces like ours on the evening news. I think so often about what it must have been like to be, there
mm-hmm,
are 12-year-old Black kids in this country who watched and learned about what happened to 12-year-old Tamir Rice a few years ago, right? Those moments in which, right as you're stepping into your identity, your country is showing you how it treats people who look, live, and love like you. So I want to believe that because of media representation, right, because of cultural changes, that there has been a lot of progress, and that Black queer kids in particular do not think of death first when they think of themselves. The fact is that, like, if you're not white, I think our relationship to peril and death, it has not changed that much. I don't think it's that much easier to be a Black boy in America, or as you said, to be a Black woman in America, if you're paying attention.
And Professor Kendi, in fact, you recently testified about this, the dual crises that we are facing. Now we're facing a crisis of the coronavirus, which is a global pandemic. Could you talk about how this, on its face, people will say, a virus doesn't discriminate, that a virus doesn't know whether you're Black or white, but actually we're finding out that it does. And would you just talk a little bit more about your thoughts about that?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's fascinating that by late March, people were calling COVID-19 the great equalizer. And they were able to do that because we didn't have any racial data. And by early April, we started calling for racial data. By the second week of April, states started releasing racial data. We started seeing racial disparities. Black and brown people in particular, and indigenous people were typically being infected and killed at higher rates. And ever since April, it's been consistent. And so even still to this day, Black people are 2.5 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than white people, and Latinx people are about 2.5 times more likely to be infected than white people from COVID-19. But by mid-April, the original explanation was, oh, it's because those Black people aren't taking the virus seriously. They're not socially distancing. Then by the end of the month, when you had white people who weren't socially distancing, who were protesting to reopen states, no longer could that argument be made. Then it switched to, well, it's because Black people have pre-existing conditions, because they don't take care of themselves. But then we know that there are actual factors that are even more pressing and more predictive than pre-existing conditions. And that's, air and water quality of one's neighborhoods. That's, your employment status. So do you work in a job in which you can socially distance? That's access to health insurance and even high quality care. And so this has never really been about what's wrong with Black people. And it's, these racial disparities have been reflective of what's wrong with our society. And that's why you've had communities finally beginning to call racism the public health crisis that it is.
How do you
I
feel
would
about
add,
Go ahead, Saeed.
well, I was going to say, I would add too, and I think Adam Thurber wrote about this in The Atlantic quite beautifully and powerfully a few months ago. I would say also it felt like as soon as at least the Trump administration realized or developed some understanding that in their mind this was a problem, this pandemic was actually just going to be a problem for Black people, as delusional as that perception is, it felt like all of a sudden the pandemic overall was taken less seriously. And it felt like that was a really key moment of change when it was like, oh, you mean middle class white people who have access to the things that Ibram just mentioned in terms of healthcare and ability to support and take care of themselves aren't going to be as impacted by this as intensely as Black and brown and indigenous people. Oh, okay. And then everybody went to the beach, and that doesn't feel coincidental to me.
How do you feel? I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, which is the fact that the current moment is one in which people other than Black people are participating. In the demonstrations we're seeing in some cities, they are majority white. Professor Kendi, your book is flying off the shelves. I'm certainly happy about that for your sake, but that couldn't be driven solely by Black people, okay? So obviously that's a good thing in the sense that people are interested in learning from your work. They're interested in joining the movement. But how do you feel about that? I mean, I'm starting to see a lot of conversation about whether the movement is being co-opted and applied to other issues, or is it that the whole question of anti-racism and, the season of sort of social unrest was originally sparked, of course, by yet another incident of police violence directed against a Black person, a Black body, or more than one. But how do you feel about that? I want to ask each of you, how do you feel about that? So you sort of surface the issue. Do you want to start?
Sure. It is complicated. In conversations with my publisher and literary agent, I noticed a spike in sales of my work as well, and it was like, oh, this is interesting. It's complicated because, of course, I think in the end you always have to embrace people who are demonstrating a willingness to do the work. Even if at times I feel a little irritated that I'm like, oh, this is what it took for you to start, asking these kinds of questions and reaching out to artists, thinkers, culture makers who have been doing this work for generations. But I'm like, okay, what's more important? Kind of getting my jab in or leveraging this moment to try to push the conversation forward. And so, that is something that's on my mind, and I'm just trying to focus on, well, let's try to get as much work done while we have their attention. It's kind of like, at least two of us have been teachers. There's that moment when you're having a class discussion, and students who, or a student who typically isn't really interested, their posture changes and they're suddenly asking questions, and you're like, oh, interesting. And I think any good teacher seizes that opportunity, instead of going, why aren't you like this every day? I think instead you try to embrace the energy.
Professor Kendi, what do you think?
I think I'm sort of been torn about it. I certainly like that readers are really gathering the books of many, not just me, but many writers who are writing on racism, who are writing, on Black life. And what I also am finding is that reading one of our books is opening up readers to other books. And I'm certainly, pointing as many readers as possible, who want to really understand about different issues, even out of my book. To other sort of writers. So, as Saeed says, to really take advantage of that attention, but at the same time, the really, when it comes to sort of gaining knowledge or self-reflection or learning or educating, I would say most Black writers, if I could speak for us, don't want people to just do this for the sake of doing it, right? We want people to transform themselves so they can transform society, so they can transform their relationship to Black people, so they can see white supremacy for what it is, so they can see sort of homophobia and sexism and transphobia for what it is, so they can see all their intersections for what it is and challenge it and be part of the movement to really dismantle all of those oppressions.
I'm wondering what this looks like, though. Have you seen this in your lifetime, Professor Kendi? I mean, have you seen true transformation take place? We've been hearing
I
different sort of
haven't.
stories about that. I mean, I will say that, at Congressman Lewis's, one of the first stages of his laying to rest was his ceremonial last crossing across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where he was received by Alabama state troopers, both white and Black, who saluted him. And for many of the people there, particularly people of a certain age, it was a moment they would never have foreseen. I mean, people were just sort of overcome by this. And yet, and yet, and yet, and yet, I mean,
Mhm.
by the time this conversation airs, I regret to say, I'm sure there will be yet another incident where someone else has lost his or her life. I don't know. So, Professor Kendi, have you actually seen it? Do you think it's actually happening? Have you seen transformation take place?
Well, I mean, I have seen it obviously at an individual level. I mean, from folks who have read our books and taken them seriously and really reflected. I've certainly seen policies change. I mean, for no-knock warrants to be banned in Louisville, and of course, we want the arrest of those officers as well who killed Breonna Taylor. But even for different cities to be a reimagining policing in general, and even defunding police. And obviously, I never thought I would see Black Lives Matter written out in front of the White House. I mean, that's something I never thought I would see. I certainly never thought I would see so many Black writers on New York Times bestsellers lists at the same time and staying there as long as we've stayed there. That's something I've never thought I would see. But at the same time, I want really lasting transformation. What I want to see is the lack of racial inequities. What I want to see is the lack of racial injustices. What I want to see is anti-racist policymakers who are committed to ensuring they're using their power, and we're of course pushing them to use their power to ensure policies are on the books that provide and lead to equity and justice for all. That's what I ultimately want to see.
So, one of the reasons your book fascinates me as a person who is not LGBTQ is how you talk about these intimate encounters that you have had throughout your life, young though you may be, with people who don't see themselves as LGBT and yet
Mhm.
are powerfully attracted to you
Mhm.
in this way. And honestly, this goes throughout our history. I mean, the fact of the matter, people who the sexual sort of congress of slave owners with enslaved women. I mean, it's just, I mean, honestly, that's sort of what came to mind. Not that, that was the sort of the power
Mhm.
dynamic, but I wonder, do you have some insights because of your experience with this in this very particular way, with the way that dynamics can shift with people who are powerfully attracted to the other, someone they perceive as the other, and yet loathe themselves for being so powerfully
Mhm.
attracted. I mean, don't you think that that's a
Yeah.
dynamic that goes beyond the sexual? And I just
Oh,
wonder
absolutely.
whether, it's like people love our music, but they don't love us, right? Or people,
Mhm.
they love
Mhm.
our
Mhm.
culture, but they don't love
Mhm.
us. And
Right.
I'm just wondering if there's something you have gleaned from this particular experience you've had with being both desired by
Mhm.
someone and
Mhm.
then they're loathing themselves for that desire that you think is
Right.
broadly applicable that you can share with us. And I know
Right.
that that's a lot, but I'm
Yeah.
just wondering since you.
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely on to something. I want to, call out Jane Ward's excellent book, Not Gay, and the subtitle is "Not Gay: Straight White Men Who Have Sex with Men." Right. So there is like a body of work, and then certainly, black men, that these are ongoing conversations about people who do not know or refuse to identify with the identities they are enacting, whether or not they, think of themselves as being such. I would say, yeah, I mean, in the same way that I think, maybe just starting with Frederick Douglass, breaking into American conversation the idea that racism or slavery was as corrosive for slave masters as it was for
Mhm.
enslaved people. I think whiteness, I think white supremacy, I think that kind of specific white male toxicity that we all deal with, whether we are white men or not, white men are also suffering from. There's a dynamic in which I feel, to go to the beginning of the conversation, when we are not examining our lives, when we are not developing a stronger relationship with ourselves and who we are, that's not a neutral status. We are suffering the entire time we don't know who we are.
Mm.
And I was very fortunate that I was able to begin this process of self-discovery, when I think it should happen, which is when we're coming of age. But we're seeing, frankly, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old Americans who have like a long distance relationship with themselves in regards to gender, race, sex, class. I think so often about like an American pastime is poor people mocking and blaming poor people, right? So like I think in all kinds of different identities, I think we see how when we don't understand ourselves, not only are we dangerous to other people or hurtful or lacking in empathy to other people who might be gay or trans or Latino or indigenous, I would also argue that those people are also suffering themselves, right? Like, I think, quite frankly, a lot of straight white men in America are miserable. I think they're unhappy. I think there's a hollowness that, whether they know it or not, they are constantly engaging. And when you don't know what's wrong with you, we tend to take it out on other people. And I think that's a major part of what's going
Hmm.
on.
That's deep. So, okay, Professor Kendi, I got to ask you something I've always wanted to ask you. So this is my chance. Um, when you think about something with such a long tail as racism and the profound how it infuses so many aspects of American life, really around the world. But how do you make what makes you laugh? Like you seem like a generally happy person. Like what makes you laugh?
I suspect just, I think I'm rooted in my culture, my
Mhm.
African American culture, and I think one of the cultural elements that I think has been passed down through the ages has been the ability to laugh even in a nightmare,
Mhm.
to be happy, even in the midst of misery, um, and to even, figure out ways to really separate, um, if that's possible, that joy from that misery. So to literally have your space, and in your space, in your Black space, let's say, you can find joy and find solace while you know what's on the other side or outside of that space. But I also know that really racism, based on my sort of chronicling of it, it's really only about 600 years old. And humans have lived for tens of thousands of years, some would argue 200,000 years. And so, in many ways, it's a young phenomenon. It's not like it's not like sexism, or religious oppression or ethnocentrism, which extends back into the ancient world. This is a new phenomenon. And so, I always try to sort of remember that, when I'm in the midst of sort of this struggle, that in a way we've caught this sort of metastatic racism early.
Wow.
Well, in the couple of minutes that we have left, I'm going to give each of you a choice. Do you want to? I'm going to give you a choice. You can either tell us what gives you hope in the current moment, or you can give us homework. Since you're both teachers. And I'm going to let you pick.
So I can give homework.
All right. Okay. Professor Kendi.
So I think my homework to folks would be to first sort of write down this definition of a racist idea, which is any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And then you can sort of put below that saying that something is wrong with a racial group is connoting that something is inferior about a racial group. And then, the homework is to choose a racial disparity, whether that's, I mentioned Black people being 2.5 times more likely to die of COVID-19, or whether that Black white wealth is about 10 times the median wealth of Blacks, or whether Black people are twice as likely to be unemployed. And just ask yourself, why? And jot down the reasons why, and see how many of those reasons fit into that definition of a racist idea.
Okay. So, what about you? You can tell us what gives you hope, or you can give us homework.
My Chihuahua gives me hope, but since that's a pretty short answer, I'll focus on homework.
Where is he or she?
He's been sitting here at my feet, totally calm. He's sitting right next to me asleep. I'm just so proud of him. Listen, you don't want to wake the dragon.
Okay. Okay.
I would say for homework, so much of what you've beautifully drawn attention to is like, the examined life, but also the way so much of what's going on feels like a bit performed, and particularly I would say, frankly, white people trying to like perform work that in the end has to be private. I can't tell you what you need to do. It is something that is about you and your relationship to self-integrity, right? I would say the homework is, think of a time, maybe it helps to focus on a word, in which you failed to honor someone's humanity across the bridge of distance. Very easily. Think of a time you used a word, a slur, or an insult that you now know that you would never want to use again, right? And I would say in your own privacy, don't talk to anybody about it. Don't ask for help about it. Do something privately to make amends. If you used a racist slur against a Vietnamese classmate when you were in school, don't reach out to that classmate. Don't burden them with your need to work out your feelings, to absolve yourselves. Read a book. Learn something about Vietnamese history. Study Vietnamese art. But do it on your own. And that's something I've been working on myself. Like, instead of centering myself in my wrongs and in my failings, and then seeking out like this need for like, please tell me I'm a good person, I think it would be more effective if we, for example, learn how to be anti-racist in private, and frankly, hold ourselves to account. And that feels like an exercise in developing a stronger integrity that, only you will know if you're doing that work.
Saeed, can I burden you with my condolences on the loss of your mother, which you write about so
Thank you.
beautifully in the book?
Thank you so much.
It's such a profound experience that I have myself gone through, and I just want to say, if I may, I appreciate you, and I appreciate your talking about what it meant to you, and on every level. So I just wanted to say that. And Professor Kendi, may I burden you by saying I'm so grateful that you have recovered from the illness that you experienced a couple of years ago. I think that had to have been a profound and life-changing experience for you. And I certainly wish you good health, especially in this current moment. And I want to thank you both so much
Thank
for
you.
your beautiful work and for talking with us about it. Syed Jones is the author of How We Fight for Our Lives, his beautiful memoir. And Ibram X. Kendi is the author most recently of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I'm sure, and I do hope we'll talk again. I'm glad we had a chance to talk together. And thank you both so much.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you so
welcome.
much.
Thank you.